Who are some sleepers for the Baltimore Ravens in organized team activities? We talk about that and more next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we've returned here with another episode of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire. We're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all platforms when they're up and running, of course, including on YouTube. We'll talk about that in a couple seconds. But yeah, here today, more Ravens talk for us. We are coming up. Now we are here the second week of OTAs for Baltimore, the first week happening last week. Then we have today. The second session starts. Then, of course, next week is the final session. And today I wanted to really talk about the sleepers for the Ravens for their OTAs that I think maybe are getting a bit undervalued, underrated, because the Ravens have a very deep roster at a lot of different positions. And I want to look at a couple, actually all the positions, and dive into if there are any guys at that position, each one of them that could be a potential sleeper that you look at and you say, well, this guy could make a huge impact, and this guy could up his stock a ton with great OTAs and kind of get his name in the coaches' heads, and that's really important. So in the second segment, we'll talk about offensive sleepers for OTAs. In the final segment, we'll talk about defensive sleepers for OTAs. In the first segment here, though, I want to dive into the Ravens' transactions so far and talk about what they have gained versus what they have lost. Now, the Ravens have lost a couple of free agents, a couple of good ones at that, but they've also brought in multiple guys. And so this isn't going to be draft. This is just going to be free agency and kind of weighing what they have brought in versus what they have lost positionally, talent-wise, contract-wise, etc. So a ton to talk about here today. First, though, before we do that, if you're with us on YouTube, welcome in. Be sure to subscribe to this channel, like the video here, of course. Our next goal here on Locked On Ravens, 2,000 subscribers, and we're creeping up on that goal. I'd love to have it before the season. Thank you to everybody who's already subscribed. And if you're thinking about it, we put out daily Ravens content 5 days a week. So if you want Ravens news, analysis, updates, 5 days a week, we have you here. Also in audio form, if you're listening in, congratulations. Megaphone, the host service that a lot of podcasts use, is down at the moment I'm recording this. And this is not just a Locked On Podcast Network issue. This is something that has affected thousands and thousands of podcasts. So that means in any audio podcast platform at the moment, you can't hear our episodes. I can't even get into Megaphone to upload an audio form episode right now. So I'm going to start saying this a little more constantly because there have been just a lot of issues with Megaphone for me over the course of the last couple of months. If you cannot get the show in audio form, it is here on YouTube in video form. So again, I have put out over 730 consecutive episodes of this 5 days a week. I've not missed one show since starting up in August of 2019. So it's frustrating to not have that because, again, it's listeners lost. It's an avenue that people can't find the show at. And who knows when it's going to be updated. Pretty much, long story short, though, I'm getting to the Ravens content, is Megaphone forgot to re-up on their certificate that pretty much helps safety. And without that certificate, when that certificate expires, you can't get into the site. You can't listen. So it's just this whole major thing that's affecting thousands and thousands of people. You live and die by technology in this age. And right now, we're unfortunately not having a great time with it. So thank you for tuning in audio form. If you're here in audio form somehow, maybe Megaphone's back up and running whenever you're listening to this, and you can hear it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. Normally it's there, but right now it's not. So if it's not up in audio form on Apple Podcasts or anywhere, it is available in video form. So let's dive into the Ravens content now. Let's talk a bit about these transactions. The Ravens, there was a lot of, I think, differing opinions just as to what the Ravens could have done in free agency. Were they going to take a kind of conservative approach, not really spend a ton of money? Were they going to really just shell out all the money in the world and bring in every single player under the sun? I think with what they had, they didn't go into the offseason with a ton of cap space. It was kind of both. And I think a lot of people after the first day, I mean, let's go back to March. Remember that first day when pretty much the Ravens did nothing? The Ravens didn't sign anybody. They didn't lose anybody. It was just a day where a lot of people signed. The Ravens weren't really a part of that. People were saying, well, why aren't the Ravens signing anybody? This is a terrible start. And then the next day you get Marcus Williams, you get Morgan Moses, two guys who I think will have big impacts for a couple of years here. Morgan Moses for at least one, Marcus Williams, I think, for all 5 of the years of his contract. So you started to get into that. Then free agents for the Ravens started to come off of the board in terms of them going elsewhere, such as Anthony Averett, Tavon Young, Bradley Bozeman. So looking at the list here, first of players who left Baltimore. Let's start there. Players who have left Baltimore and have signed with new teams. So I'm not counting guys who haven't signed with anybody yet. Justin Ellis went from the Ravens to the Giants. Khalil Dorsey, same thing. Anthony Averett from the Ravens to the Raiders. Tyson Williams, the Ravens to the Colts. Sammy Watkins to Green Bay. Deshaun Elliott and Chris Board, both to Detroit. Tavon Young to Chicago. Bradley Bozeman and Chris Westry to Carolina for both of them. Now, the players who have come into Baltimore, you have Marcus Williams coming in, Morgan Moses. You have Mike Davis, Kyle Fuller, and Brent Urban. And a couple of re-signings also, but I'm not going to count those right now. So what the Ravens have lost in terms of quantity, they've lost more free agents than they have brought in. And I feel like that's pretty normal just because you have the lower level guys and then obviously the guys you might not want to lose. It's kind of a combination of those. So, I mean, we can just count down the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 guys left Baltimore and brought in. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the moment. So, the Ravens have lost about double the amount of free agents they brought in. But let's talk about quality. I think Marcus Williams is by far and away the best player on this list. He is also by far and away the player who signed for the most total money. 5 for 70 is great value. Again, one of the higher free agent numbers we have seen the Ravens give out in a couple years to not a player of their own. We've seen Baltimore love to re-sign their own guys, reinvest in those players. Marlon Humphrey, Ronnie Stanley, recent examples of that. Mark Andrews, of course. Yeah, Pasha McCary. So it's the scale, right? It depends whether that player is a high-level player, more of a quality backup, etc. You don't really see that, and a lot of people were wondering, well, for Tyrann Mathieu, who a lot of people link to the Ravens, why would they sign him after what happened with Earl Thomas? Why would they invest in the safety position? Why would they give out a big money contract when you don't really know? The Earl Thomas signing was just one that never really felt right from the start, honestly, in my opinion. Again, great player on the field. We know what happened off of it. Marcus Williams just feels right. It feels like he fits in this locker room, fits on the field. It's really exciting. And the talent level the Ravens lost, if you look at positionally, it's at corner. The Ravens lost, I think, the most at the cornerback position with Anthony Averett and Khalil Dorsey, Tavon Young, Chris Westry. They lost 4 guys at cornerback on their team from last year. And if you want to go secondary in particular, if you want to expand that, Deshaun Elliott as well left. And that's another, decently sized loss. But you replace Deshaun Elliott with Marcus Williams. You replace, let's say, Anthony Averett with Kyle Fuller. And then the draft picks, if you want to go down to the draft picks now, you can talk about, well, replacing Tavon Young with Marion Williams and replacing guys like Chris Westry with Jalen Armour-Davis. I think the Ravens upgraded in that department. Offensive line, the Ravens added in Morgan Moses without losing anyone in free agency. Defensive line, the Ravens lost Justin Ellis. They bring in both Michael Pierce and Brent Urban. That's an upgrade there. They don't end up bringing in a wide receiver, so Sammy Watkins leaves. Is that addition by subtraction to free up some playing time for some other guys? Yeah, I think in a way it is. But then Chris Board, you don't really replace that through free agency. Bradley Bozeman, you replace that in the draft with Tyler Linderbaum. I think that will be an upgrade overall when we're looking back at this at the end of the season. If you want to replace Tyson Williams, you do that with Mike Davis. The Ravens did that. So I think free agency was a success for the team. And again, sometimes quality is better than quantity, right? And I think the Ravens did that, losing 10 guys, bringing in 5 from outside the team. The Ravens value comp picks, right? But they kind of threw that to the wayside a little bit and said, look, they know they have a window, and that window that they want to capitalize on is before Lamar Jackson really starts to cost a lot of money, which when he signs that deal and whenever that is, it feels like he is going to be taking up a significant amount of that cap. So Baltimore wants to maximize on that now. And I think that is the absolute right decision, but it's also about being smart. It's not going all in with the money and saying, well, we're going to put ourselves in financial purgatory for however many years, 5 years, because it's all in for 2 years, and then you don't really get anything else. So the contracts become backloaded, and it's just not great. The Ravens were smart with their money, but they also were aggressive with their money in a way, and I think added quality playmakers while losing some talent. I'm not going to lie, but I think the end all of when you're weighing what they brought in versus what they lost, you might have more pieces on the side that they lost, but I think the scale still tips toward Baltimore in the quality aspect when you talk about who they brought in free agency. But we'll head into our first break here on Locked On Ravens. Still a ton to talk about. When we get back, we'll be diving into some sleepers to look at for the rest of OTAs for Baltimore on the offensive side of the ball. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. First, though, I do want to tell you a bit about Rock Auto. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto, and with the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need, and sometimes there can be pretty intimidating or even pointless questioning, and you have to wait while the person behind the counter ends up ordering the parts on their computer because they really only can choose the brand their warehouse happens to carry. But now you have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. And why you should choose Rock Auto is because you can save time and money when using Rock Auto. They're also a family business, so they've been serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years, and you can explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto parts needs, and the prices are really, really low for every single customer. So go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck, right? Locked On. They had you here, but us back, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. We're back here. Our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still hanging out with you here. And again, thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube so you don't miss any content here on the show. And if you hear us in audio form, you somehow found a way, your megaphone is back up. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to follow us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. Let's now talk about, though, the Ravens and OTAs. They have their second session kicking off today on Tuesday. And it will be, I think, a really good thing because, again, all reps are important reps. And when you're looking at guys who are looking to establish themselves on a roster and any team, anywhere across the NFL, this is a great way to start that. So we're going to move away from the stars a little bit, talk about some sleepers on the offensive side of the ball that I think could really, if with good OTA showings, people who we could really start to hear the names of as training camp starts and the preseason goes on. So let's talk about the quarterback position. And I'll say Brent Hundley is someone who could potentially be a sleeper here. Hundley signed with the Ravens about a week ago, a little less than a week ago. Really high expectations, I think, was a fifth rounder out of UCLA, started some games in Green Bay. It's kind of bounced around a little bit, but I don't want to go Lamar Jackson. I don't want to go Tyler Huntley. So I'm going to go with Brent Hundley. Yes, Tyler Huntley, Brett Hundley is how it ends up going there. I think Hundley is someone who won't make the roster, not because of anything that he would show or not show, but I still think the Ravens are going to keep two quarterbacks. But there is a spot on the practice squad open, and if he outperforms any expectations in the preseason or in training camp or even just starting that off in OTAs, I think that maybe another team looks at him and a team that keeps three quarterbacks potentially, maybe it is the Ravens. I don't know how many they're going to keep right now, but if the Ravens keep two and an opportunity presents itself for Hundley to go on a roster with three quarterbacks. I mean, look, the Cardinals last year ended up poaching Trace McSorley from the Ravens practice squad when they were carrying three quarterbacks and the Ravens only had two, and they were keeping McSorley on the practice squad. So Huntley is a player that is the backup to Lamar Jackson. Tyler Huntley is the player. All the Huntley stuff might be a little confusing. So Tyler Huntley is the backup to Lamar Jackson. Those two are absolute locks to make the roster. Hundley, on the other hand, I think has a great shot to make the practice squad, is just an experienced guy, has been around the league, kind of fits in with the Ravens play style right now. So that's a player that I look out for personally at the quarterback position. Moving on to running back, I think a forgotten player here. And, you know, we all talk about J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards and super, super excited for Tyler Beatty too. He's someone who you could classify as a sleeper, I guess. But to me, he's somebody who is the front runner for the number 3 running back job. We know about Justice Hill. We know about Mike Davis, the veteran players there. But two guys I'll look at are Nate McCreary and Ricky Person. Ricky Person is an undrafted guy out of NC State. I think he is a very intriguing player to watch because, again, while he might not make the roster outright, there are going to be spots on the practice squad. I think Baltimore could definitely keep two running backs. Person is someone who's 6 foot 217, 22 years old. So, you know, has had a ton of experience throughout college. But I think for him, if he's able to show a lot of skills during OTAs and maybe just barely, like maybe he's the 54th, 55th man to be on the roster, which obviously means you're not on the roster since it's 53 guys. I think that's a practice squad spot. And to me, Baltimore, and I think to a lot of players, Baltimore is one of the more attractive destinations for running backs because of their run-heavy offense. And now we don't know exactly how it's going to look this season, just based off of pass attempts. Again, Baltimore in 2019 and 2020, last in pass attempts, 2021, they move up to ninth. And again, product of injuries, whatever you want to call it there. But Person is a player that I feel like could make an impact and be potentially a practice squad player. And look, all these guys have a shot to make the roster. I'm not gonna discount anybody from making the roster and saying, oh, well, there's 100% chance this guy doesn't make the roster. No, there's always a chance for these guys. And no matter how small it is, they're going to take that chance. They're going to hold on to it, and they're going to believe in themselves, which I think is great. So for Person, while he has, I think, an uphill battle to make the roster with just all the depth that the team has there, I think that there is a clear shot for him to establish himself, really impress, and still make the practice squad, something that the Ravens were going to do with Nate McCreary after the whole thing happened with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, but then he gets claimed by the Denver Broncos, and then he ends up making his way back after the Broncos cut him. McCreary's a player that, I think has been rather forgotten. Really impressed during the preseason alongside Tyson Williams last year. Williams ends up making the roster, and McCreary's one of the odd men out there. People were wanting him to make the roster, though, and he offers a skill set that I think could be very valuable to the Ravens. Runs very, very, very hard. I like the way that he ends up just, fighting for extra yards, running through contact, and that's a skill set. I mean, the Ravens love those extra yards, those fighters for extra yards. McCreary's 6 feet, 213 pounds, so a very similar build to Person. So maybe it's one or the other if the Ravens want to go with different skill sets, but I wouldn't be shocked if either of those guys don't make the roster if the Ravens want to keep both of them on the practice squad just in case, or if J.K. Dobbins or Gus Edwards has to go on the PUP list, maybe that gives an opportunity if they outperform a Mike Davis, for example, or a Justice Hill, for them to catapult. So there are options for the Ravens at running back. They have really stocked up with the position, which I obviously think is the right decision based off of what happened. You have to go out there when you're the Ravens last year, right before the season starts, bring in Devonta Freeman and Le'Veon Bell and Latavius Murray, just guys who, two of them were cut by the Saints. One of them just, the running style of Le'Veon Bell didn't really fit the Ravens, and he didn't really have success. So this year they have the bodies there to, even if Dobbins or Edwards isn't ready to go, I think be prepared all throughout the season, unless just that terrible injury like happens, which I'm hoping. I am praying that does not happen again. Fullback, I mean, if you want a sleeper there, it's going to be Ben Mason. I don't know how much of a sleeper I'd classify that. I think Ben Mason is a practice squad candidate. I'd be pretty shocked if the Ravens kept two fullbacks on their roster with Ricard back in the fold. But hey, you know what? Ben Mason back in Baltimore, maybe he makes an impact there. Wide receiver, there are plenty of guys that I could talk about here that I am very, very high on. I mean, some of the guys that I like from the undrafted class, Slade Bolden, Shamar Bridges, you have Mekhi Polk, and a couple other guys too, Devin Williams, who I think is really good. They have options there, and with the Ravens not bringing in a veteran wide receiver, this is an opportunity for some of those guys to establish themselves. And in the Ravens, the rookie minicamp wire that the Ravens dropped, T. Martin was asked about the wide receivers, some of those guys, and he said Shamar Bridges was the one who was picking up things the fastest. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're getting in the coaches' heads. You're establishing a name for yourself early on. So, while Shamar Bridges, he's a 24-year-old rookie out of Fort Valley State College. He's 6'4", 207. They brought in a very specific type of wide receiver here. Shamar Bridges is 6'4", 207. Javon Clark, 6'3", 193. Mekhi Polk, 6'3", 197. And other guys as well. Devin Williams, 6'5", 211. I mean, they brought in guys. Riley Webb, 6'2", 204. Those are all receivers. They know they need a big body presence on this roster. That's why my choice for a veteran guy is still Julio Jones. But I think if I had to pick 3 or 4 guys out of that list of 6 or 7, I'd say Slade Bolden, Shamar Bridges, Mekhi Polk, and Devin Williams are the guys I'm looking out for. But then also looking at Benjamin Victor and Jalen Moore, guys who have been around the team for at least a couple seasons, and I think have earned a shot at this point. And I mean, who else do the Ravens have? It's going to be a battle between these guys. Jalen Moore is 5'11", 191. Benjamin Victor's tall. Benjamin Victor 6'4", 199. But, Benjamin Victor and Jalen Moore are the older guys in that room in terms of players who haven't made the roster yet at this point. Benjamin Victor's 25, Jalen Moore's 24. The other guys you're looking at are, 22, 20, some of those ages as well. So I think for the Ravens, they are set there. but I would look to some of those undrafted guys as some sleepers at that position. Tight end, I don't really know if there's a tight end who I think is a sleeper at this point. Maybe Tony Poyan, who's on this roster. He's listed on this roster right now, 6'7" guy. He's a player that could really work out for them, but I feel like they're set there and they don't necessarily need to overthink this. I think they will keep 4 tight ends and Mark Andrews, Nick Boyle, Charlie Kolar, and Isaiah Likely. So if you're looking for a guy, maybe it's Tony Poyan, but I think the Ravens are pretty set there at the tight end position. Finally, the tackle position. Aaron Johnson, an undrafted guy out of South Dakota State. Cole Jackson talked about him a little bit when he was on here with me a couple weeks ago. 6'5", 305 guy. I think he can make an impact. But someone I want to point out is Tristan Colon. Now, Colon's spot on this roster, I think, right now is one of the more interesting ones to look at because so the Ravens obviously drafted Tyler Linderbaum, right? They have Patrick McCary, who at this point I think is better suited as the Super 6 sub. Not a slight to his talent. I think he could definitely start, but I think that's just a better role. So do the Ravens keep technically 3 centers? They have a lot of depth on the offensive line. So maybe the Ravens up to move away from Tristan Colon. I don't know. I personally think he's a very good player, but where's the room for him on the roster? That's something that you got to kind of look at a little bit. Another guy I think is a more not necessarily a sleeper, but more underrated at this point is Tyree Phillips. And you might be thinking, oh no, not Tyree Phillips. And look, I get it. His tackle play is not it. And I'm moving him away from tackle. He is a guard, in my opinion. I think that is exactly where they should play him. But the Ravens have had to play him at tackle out of just pure need, right? Guys go down. The Ravens, Phillips was a tackle coming out of college, so Baltimore's had to kick him out to right tackle, and the results have not been good. But as a guard, I've liked what I've seen from him. That left guard position, the battle's probably going to come down to Ben Cleveland, Ben Powers, and Tyree Phillips. I think Phillips is a dark horse to win that. You could also classify Cleveland as a dark horse to win that too. It feels like Powers will maybe have the edge in day one of training camp, but then maybe another guy can take that from him. So I don't know. I think that Phillips has a good shot to win that guard battle. But again, we're not really going to know until the Ravens. Maybe McCary wins that, maybe he's the guy who steps in and starts at left guard. So that battle's going to be one to watch for sure. So those are a couple sleepers on the offensive side of the ball for OTAs. But when we get back here in our final segment, we'll be diving into defensive sleepers on the defensive side of the ball for OTAs. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. We're back here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you. Again, thank you for making Locked On Ravens your first listen of the day. Be sure to make your second listen Locked On NFL, where our hosts go all around the network and talk about the latest NFL trends, news, and more. Well, let's now dive into defensive sleepers here, and we'll just, again, go in order. Talk about the positions one by one. If there are any guys I want to mention, I will most certainly mention them. But first off here, the defensive tackle position. There are a couple guys that I feel like could really make an impact. I feel like they're pretty set when it comes to the defensive line. Like there are 7 guys right now who I feel like are locks. But then again, can you keep 7 or not? Obviously, Calais Campbell, Travis Jones, Desmond Adebike, Michael Pierce, Broderick Washington. You have Derek Wolfe, Brent Urban in there as well. I think a guy, though, who could make an impact is Isaiah Mack. Isaiah Mack was somebody who came in and was one of the injury guys, right? Someone who came in when the Ravens were just depleted with injuries and came in, had a couple of sacks on Joe Burrow and pressures in that Cincinnati game. Now, the outcome of that game wasn't great, but, you get the point. I think that Baltimore might have found a gem in him, and if he can maybe make a push, I don't know who he would make this roster over. Maybe Broderick Washington has a bad preseason, or the Ravens do let go of Derek Wolfe. Maybe that's a way that Matt can make this roster. Aaron Crawford's been around for a couple years. He's on this roster. You have Rashad Nichols, who is a undrafted guy out of Stephen F. Austin State, 6'2", 305 guy. So there are a couple guys who could really establish themselves. But I think the Ravens on the defensive line are pretty set. I don't think there's necessarily any big shocking surprise, but a couple of those guys could establish themselves and maybe work their way into a guaranteed practice squad spot. And again, just get in the heads of the coaches. Let's talk about outside linebackers next. There are a couple guys here that I think are sleepers. Jeremiah Moon is someone out of Florida who I think is incredible. You have Chuck Wiley, who out of Texas, San Antonio. Those are 2 guys who the Ravens signed as undrafted free agents. And the Ravens have had success finding those outside linebackers in the later rounds, the undrafted pools as well. And obviously all across the draft board, right? It's not just undrafted free agency, but I think Wiley's a player that has a very interesting skill set, a very good build as well. He's 6'2", 251. Jeremiah Moon is huge. He's 6'5", 247. And both of those players are right in the 23, 24-year-old range. So I think, again, for a position that you're kind of wondering at, right? It's when is Ty Scouser coming back? When is David Ojabo coming back? You're thinking about it and you're thinking, well, maybe there's an opportunity. Justin Houston feels likely to come back, but he's not back yet. So you have to kind of work with this a day at a time. If the Ravens need a guy, or if, let's say, those guys both make the practice squad, it's, again, getting in the coaches' heads and being able to say, hey, look, I can do this. I had a good day this day and this day and this day. Maybe a guy can sneak on the 53-man, especially if Justin Houston doesn't return, which, again, I anticipate happening, but it's not official till it happens. So you never really know at that point. Then looking at inside linebackers, I mean, same thing. There are a couple guys who could make a name for themselves. Here's Kobe McLean's one of my favorite guys out of Auburn here, 5'11", 227. So kind of on the smaller side. Josh Ross out of Michigan, again, just felt like a Raven from the jump with Mike McDonald coming over to Baltimore. He's 6 feet, 225. The reason because Ross went to Michigan, was a team captain there as well. There are a couple others as well, but I feel like those two are the ones I'm kind of honing in on. But the Ravens made it a huge, huge thing for them to bring in some of these undrafted linebackers because they didn't draft one and they ended up losing Chris Board. Kristen Welch is another one, more of a proven option. He ended up making the roster last year, or for the past 2 years, as an undrafted guy. And he, coming out of Iowa, has made impressive contributions on special teams, has played some defensive snaps as well. So look at Kristen Welch again, someone who at this point, the Ravens, the locks to me at the inside linebacker position, Josh Bynes, Malik Harrison, and Patrick Queen, right? Those are the three right now. Do they need to keep 5 inside linebackers with them potentially using 3 safety looks with Chuck Clark? They don't necessarily have to. They can maybe keep 4 guys and say, all right, it's going to be Queen, Harrison, Bynes, and Welch, and that'll be that. But I think if they did keep 5, Welch would make that roster. Then you'd maybe have one of the undrafted guys make it as well. So Baltimore has options there, guys who can establish themselves in undrafted or in OTAs as undrafted guys. Then looking at the cornerback position, again, it just seems like such a deep position at this point where I don't see players like Robert Jackson or Amon Marshall, the myth of Amon Marshall, unfortunately, with his injury history and what he's been able to do. Kevon Seymour, I don't see any of those guys being able to make this roster. Very talented, like Denzel Williams is talented, but again, maybe a guy I'm looking at as a potential sleeper is Demarion Williams, someone who has the potential to fill in for Tavon Young, but he's going to be going up against other sleepers that I think, such as Brandon Stevens, who isn't, he's more of I'll call him an established sleeper, someone who showed a lot during his rookie season, got ample amounts of playing time because of injuries, and showed a lot of flashes. But another guy I want to talk about is Armour-Davis Washington. Now, whether you classify him as a cornerback or a safety, I get if you put him in either different role. I'm placing him in cornerback right now just because I believe the team does view him as a slot guy. I am all in on Armour-Davis Washington. I'm a very big fan of him. I think that he has the potential to be a stud at this level. So while he might be listed as a safety, I still think that he is better suited at cornerback, and that's where the Ravens, I think, view him as well. So I'd be looking out for Armour-Davis Washington as maybe the big sleeper of OTAs moving into training camp, et cetera, et cetera. And then let's look at safety here. The Ravens, again, I don't really view any of these guys as sleepers. I mean, there isn't really a lot of room for an undrafted guy to make the roster. Baltimore cut Chris Moore. No, not that Chris Moore. Safety Chris Moore, they're one of their undrafted players from this year, not the wide receiver. So again, it just feels like looking at who they have, Kyle Hamilton, Chuck Clark, Tony Jefferson, Geno Stone, Marcus Williams, that's 5 guys right there, plus other versatile options such as Brandon Stevens and Armour-Davis Washington who can play in those roles. I just don't see any way that another guy makes that roster unless obviously injuries. You got to prepare for the injuries, but even they don't really have a safety on the roster besides those guys. I mean, listed on their roster right now, I'm looking at it: Chuck Clark, Kyle Hamilton, Tony Jefferson, Geno Stone, Armour-Davis Washington, Marcus Williams. Brandon Stevens, I believe, is classified on here as a DB. Yep, DB. So I don't really see a sleeper at the safety position. I'll call it Armour-Davis Washington again, double dip for Armour-Davis Washington, and kind of give my my promotion of him, saying that I think he's going to be great at this level. I think he has an opportunity to really establish himself. And so Baltimore all across the board, a lot of different sleepers who could make names for themselves in OTAs. And again, that carries into training camp, it carries into the preseason, establishing that rapport with guys, with teammates, and with coaches, with reps and reps and reps. That's the important thing that it comes down to. So Baltimore with these OTAs still, again, first session done, second session this week, third session next week. Ample opportunity for guys to establish names for themselves. That's what I have you here today, though, on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in. When we get back here tomorrow, I'll be answering your mailbag questions, so be sure to stay tuned for that, and I will see you tomorrow.